Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. Today I'm sharing an easy Wobble Action Card using the Toadally Awesome birthday stamp set from Pajama Crafter Stamps. This is such an easy card to create with a freehand watercolor background that is super simple. Really the hardest part is fussy cutting those frogs, but the result is totally worth it. This is the Totally Awesome birthday stamp set. You can see there's a ton of different sentiments in there, as well as several different frog positions, if you will. I'm going to stamp and emboss several of them to use or to pick and choose from in my card. I'm going to emboss them with some green embossing powder because I think it's going to work perfectly with the images. You could emboss them with another color if you prefer. I'm going to watercolor these, so I'm working with some watercolor cardstock. I use a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock before I emboss it. That way, if I happen to get any oils from my fingers on that cardstock, there's less of a chance of that embossing powder sticking on the cardstock in those areas. Now, I've used this stamp set before, so I can get right into stamping. If you have a new stamp set, what I recommend is using a white eraser on the stamping surface, just rubbing it a little bit and then using a soft brush to remove those eraser bits. It just helps the stamps take ink just a little bit better. So I used some embossing ink on my stamp and then stamped it multiple times to make sure we have nice, clear, crisp images. Then poured my embossing powder on those images, poured the excess off, and then used my embossing tool to melt that powder. Now you want to make sure that it goes from the matte granular look to the glossy finish to make sure that it's all completely embossed. Like I said before, I'm watercoloring my images. You could just use green ink and color them with your favorite coloring medium if you prefer, but I just thought that the watercolor would work well for both the images as well as a super simple background. I'm going to start by using some light blue ink to do a little bit of ink blending on my background. I have two backgrounds here. I'm not sure at the beginning whether I'm going to do a horizontal or vertical card. So the backgrounds are super simple. So I'm just going to do two and make it easy on myself so I can pick and choose which one to use once I am at that point. So I used light blue on the top. I'm using a blue-green on the bottom. I am going to create just some super simple background. I want the focal point to be my frogs, but I do want to have a supporting background to it. You could just do this ink blending and use it this way, but I think a little bit of very simple watercoloring, creating some bulrushes as well as lily pads are going to go with the frog theme for this particular card. So I have some dye-based re-inkers that I have in a palette here. These are meant to re-ink dye pads, but they work perfectly for watercolor. I have a water brush that has water in the handle. So to my right, I have some paper towel that when I want to change the colors, I can easily just squeeze the handle and brush it off on that paper towel. To create the bulrushes, I'm just starting at the bottom and kind of flicking my brush up in order to create those bulrushes as well, or the greens as well as the stems. Then I'm using a darker green to create some lily pad shapes on the water. Now the first one that I created is a little bit dark, so for the next ones I'm going to create them just a little bit lighter. Again, I want the focal point to be my frogs, and by creating them a little bit too dark, that focal point or your eye is going to get drawn to the darker shape. So I'm going to keep them a little bit lighter. I'm going to repeat the same process on the second card using a lighter to medium green to create the bulrushes as well as the stems, or the greens as well as the stems in the background. Once those are dry, we're going to create some bulrushes on them. Those are just long ovals. So again, a very simple shape. And by doing it in a lighter color, it kind of creates a more serene, wispy, magical kind of background, if you will. Now, I'm not someone that typically will freehand a background like this, but I kind of thought bulrushes and lily pads are fairly simple shapes, as well as the fact that the stamps, the frog stamps in the Totally Awesome stamp set are more characters. They're not necessarily realistic looking frogs. So I think you can get away with being a little bit creative with the background. The lily pads themselves are basically ovals with a little kind of notch out of them. Like I said, bulrushes are long ovals. The greenery, when you flick that brush up, it kind of creates the greens all on their own. So when it comes to those bulrushes, I'm going to make some of them a little bit darker, some of them a little bit lighter. You can easily go back over them and make it darker if you find that it's too light, but I always love having a variety of different tones. I think it just gives it a little bit more interest to it. The ones that are a little bit lighter, in my opinion, look a little bit more farther away. The ones that are a little bit darker look a little bit bit closer. Once we have the bulrushes done, I'm going to let them completely, or let the backgrounds completely dry, and we're going to watercolor our frogs. So this background, or these backgrounds, are on watercolor cardstock as well. Even though we did that ink blending first, we are watercoloring on it, and you want to make sure that you're using a cardstock that can handle that water. Mixed media cardstock would also work here because it can handle a little bit of moisture, but you don't want to use regular cardstock because it's not intended for techniques with water, and it kind of bubbles. It has a different reaction to it than just regular watercolor cardstock or mixed media cardstock. So once those are done, we can set those to the side. We want to wait until they're completely dry before we move on to the next step. And while those are drying, we can watercolor our frogs. Now I'm choosing about a medium tone green for the frogs. I'm going to choose a lighter color for the bellies for the frogs. I'm going to choose a darker green for the insides of the mouths, and then a red color for their tongues. Because we heat embossed the areas or the images for those frogs, it kind of leaves a little ridge that helps to watercolor it a little bit easier. It leaves the watercolor in there so we don't have to worry quite so much about it blending and bleeding with other colors that are beside it. For instance, the tongue on the inside of the mouth. That makes it just a little bit easier for watercoloring, as well as the fact that I find with watercolor, if you don't emboss it, you end up having kind of a monotone finish to it. That embossing adds a shiny line, and it gives it a little bit of extra texture and a little bit of shine that your eye gets drawn to. It also gives you a little bit of a ridge when we go to do the fussy cutting, because I don't have a die to coordinate with this stamp set. It gives you a little ridge to cut around when you're doing your fussy cutting. I'm choosing to watercolor all 3 frogs at once so that I can do one color for all 3 frogs and then move on to a different color. This way I don't have to wash out my brush quite as much. If you prefer, you could easily do one frog at a time and just clean off your brush as you're working with different colors in it. The other thing that I like to do with things like this is, because when you see frogs, they have those kind of bulgy eyes, I'm going to add something called glossy accents to the eyes while it's drying. It's going to give them some nice glossy domed dimension. Now I am doing it before I'm doing the fussy cutting, only because on this particular day I have some errands to run, so it's going to have some time to dry before I do that fussy cutting while the watercolor is drying and before I have time to do the fussy cutting. If you prefer, you can wait until your card is completely finished and then do the glossy accents, but because of the amount used, you want to give it probably a good hour to dry completely. Sometimes if it's dry on the top surface, it's not really totally dry on the inside. One way that is a great way to check is once you put the dots on your stamped or images or whatever you're doing, is to grab some scrap paper and put some similar sized dots on that scrap paper. That way, if you want to test it, you can test the ones on the scrap paper without ruining your actual images. When it comes to the fussy cutting, I am right-handed, so I have my scissors in my right hand, and you want to use some really sharp detail scissors for this. It definitely helps with that fussy cutting. You'll notice that my right hand doesn't really change position too much. My left hand is guiding that cardstock, guiding the lines of that stamped image into the path of the blade of my scissors. This is the best way to do fussy cutting. This isn't the most simple shape for fussy cutting, so it is going to be a little bit more challenging, especially for beginners. I am working right along the edge of that embossed stamp line, but some people prefer to leave a little bit of a white halo around. Both of those are totally right. If you're going to leave a little bit of a halo around, though, you definitely want to try to make sure that that halo is even all the way around your image, and it's really just dependent on the look that you're going for. For this particular one, I didn't want that halo around there, so I'm cutting right along the outside edge of that stamped image, making sure to move that paper in my way. Really the hardest part of this entire card is this fussy cutting, and it's really not that hard. For these images, the little webbed hands and little webbed feet are really the most challenging bits. We want to make sure that we get it all the way in, and we don't leave wonky shapes, shall we say. Now, I chose to emboss this with that green embossing powder because I wanted it to coordinate with my watercoloring. If you prefer, you could use black embossing powder. If you wanted to see those lines a little bit more or a little bit better, you could easily change that up. It's such a simple thing to change, but sometimes I just love working with colored embossing powders, and I think they give a really interesting and unique look to it and coordinate with our image just a little bit more. So once we have this fussy cut, we can set this over to the side and we can start to assemble our card. The one thing that I want to do before assembling my card is put a sentiment on the background though, and there's so many different sentiments to choose from with this set. Now I'm going to take my background here. It was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I want to trim this down 1/4 inch on each side to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have a piece of brown cardstock to the side that's trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches to use as a mat on this. Now before we add that sentiment, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending around the outside edges. I just like it when the edges are a little bit darker than the center. It just frames it in a little bit more, and I think it gives it a little bit more finished look. This is a step that you could eliminate if you didn't want to do it, or if you didn't necessarily like it being darker around the edges, but I definitely prefer it. With that ink blending done, we're going to stamp and emboss our sentiment, and I'm going to use the Your, and I'm going to use the Unforgettable. Now, the great thing about the sentiments in this set is some of them are just a word or two, and you can mix and match them to create different sentiments. So there's totally, there's awesome, there's happy birthday, there's unforgettable, there's your, and then there's so there's a bunch of different ones that you can mix and match together to create your sentiment. So I am putting Your Unforgettable, and I have them on, or I laid them on my piece, put them on my Misty lid, and then I just made sure that they were nice and straight. There's grid lines on that lid, so it definitely helps to make sure that your pieces are completely straight on there, not moving up or down to one side. I'm going to use some brown embossing powder for my sentiment. I wanted to make sure that it stood out from my background, and even though we have the brown bulrushes there, the sentiment still stands out because we have that domed glossy dimension or glossy finish for that. You may have noticed that my embossing powder stuck to the edges of that cardstock. That's because I had just done that ink blending there and that ink wasn't completely dry. It's super easy to just use a soft brush and brush that away so that we don't accidentally melt that on there. Now I thought it'd be nice to have a little bit of splatter in my background, so I'm just using a shimmer splatter on that background. I'll let that dry for a few minutes just to give a little bit of a different finish and something to catch the eye on that background. I'm going to glue my mat to my A2 card base, and then I'm gluing my image piece. I'm just using Barely Art glue. It's a nice liquid glue. I use it for almost everything. I love the fact that with using liquid glue, it gives you that little bit of wiggle room and shimmer. I'm going to use some mini action wobblers to create that action wobble movement on the card. These are mini ones, so they're the perfect size for these frogs. They have adhesive on them already, so they're super easy to add to your fussy cut frog image. Take the backing off and then add to the card. And these will go completely flat to add to an envelope, and once you pull that card out of the envelope, they'll pop up and they'll wiggle a little bit. So it's an easy way to create some really fun interactive movement, and I think that movement works perfectly for those frogs as well. This is the finished card. Again, super quick and easy. The thing that took the longest was cutting those frogs out, but I think they're absolutely adorable. I love the character that these frogs have, and the fact that there are so many different ways to create sentiments with that stamp set makes it so useful. You'll find all of the Pajama Crafter stamp supplies that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate all the time that you spend here.